a cold December night settled over Kent, England, wrapping the countryside in fog and silence. A dark BMW cruised along a narrow road, its headlights barely piercing the mist. Inside were two men dressed in full police uniforms, badges gleaming, faces calm. To anyone watching, they looked like officers on a late-night patrol. In reality, they were the lead actors in a criminal plot that would soon become the largest cash robbery in British history. Weeks earlier, in a quiet pub on the outskirts of London, a different kind of meeting had taken place. Four men gathered around a corner table, their drinks barely touched. On the table were blueprints, surveillance photos, shift schedules, and lists of names. The leader, a man named Leon, leaned forward and tapped a finger on the blueprint of the Securitas cash depot in Tonbridge. "That's the target," he said. "Up to £200 million inside at any given time. And on Thursday night the vault is full for weekend distribution." The others exchanged glances, nervous, excited, but committed. Each man brought a specific skill: surveillance, logistics, security systems, and intimidation. But the real weapon wasn't firepower. It was deception. The plan was as bold as it was simple: disguise themselves as police officers, use a fake arrest to kidnap the depot manager and his family, force him to give them access. No gun battles, no alarms, just psychological control and a few well-rehearsed moves. Over the next several weeks, the gang worked in silence. Police uniforms were tailored to perfection. A stolen and modified police van was prepped with fake decals and lights. Radios were programmed to mimic real police chatter. Every detail was checked twice: the depot's schedule, the guards' routines, even the make and model of actual Kent police vehicles. An inside source helped map out security weak points and confirmed who would be on shift the night of the heist. The crew ran through the plan again and again, refining their roles until it felt like second nature. To them, it wasn't just a robbery, it was a performance. Then, on the night of February 21st, 2006, they moved. At 6:30 p.m., the fake police car pulled over the depot manager, Colin Dixon, who was driving home. The gang members, in full uniform, approached with practiced authority. They told him there was a serious issue and he needed to come with them. Dixon complied, thinking it was a routine matter. Minutes later, another team abducted Dixon's wife and young child from their home, calmly and quietly. The message was clear: cooperate, and no one gets hurt. Back at the depot, with Dixon under pressure and his family held hostage, the gang arrived in their police van. The guards at the depot, seeing what they believed to be a legitimate police escort with their own manager, opened the gates. What happened next was swift and chilling. The gang restrained the staff, disabled security systems, and spent over an hour loading more than £53 million in cash into their van. Not a single shot was fired. By the time the real police were called, the gang had vanished into the night. What was left behind was chaos: bound employees, an empty vault, and a stunned nation waking up to the news that its largest cash depot had been cleaned out by men dressed as the very people meant to protect it. And this was just the beginning. The night was still, the air heavy with tension, as the fake police van rolled through the open gates of the Securitas depot in Tonbridge. It was shortly after 1 a.m. The building, a secure fortress of concrete and steel, was designed to protect millions. But that night, it welcomed the very men who would rob it blind. Colin Dixon, the depot manager, walked stiffly ahead of the group, flanked by two gang members posing as police officers. The security staff, seeing their superior and believing the ruse, let them in without hesitation. A few polite nods, a flash of phony ID, and the gang was inside. Within seconds, the mood shifted. The gang sprang into action with clinical precision. Faces hidden behind balaclavas, they drew weapons, not to kill, but to control. Orders were barked, commands obeyed. The employees, about 14 in total, were quickly subdued and restrained with cable ties. Some were forced to lie on the cold concrete floor of the loading bay. Others were herded into a holding room, watched by armed guards. There was no panic, only the tight grip of fear. The robbers moved with discipline. Every man knew his role. Some guarded the hostages, others wheeled metal cages full of cash toward the loading area. A few barked quiet instructions over radios, coordinating the movements like a well-drilled unit. No shouting, no chaos, just method. The depot vaults had been opened under duress by Dixon. He complied without resistance. His wife and child were being held elsewhere, their safety dependent on his cooperation. Every moment stretched long and tight. The gang wore gloves, left no fingerprints. Security cameras were turned away or taped over. Phones were disabled, watches synchronized. Bundle by bundle, they loaded the loot into the van. Plastic-wrapped stacks of notes, some fresh, others weathered, piled into containers like bricks. 5 shillings, 10 shillings, 20 shillings, cash that was destined for banks and ATMs across the southeast. Pallets of it, heavy enough that some cages groaned under the weight. Over the next 66 minutes, they moved a staggering £53 million in cash. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And still, they remained eerily calm. Back in the holding room, the hostages huddled in silence. Most had worked there for years, handling millions daily, but never had money felt so menacing. The robbers spoke little. When they did, their voices were low, steady. One even offered water to an elderly employee who looked faint. It was this strange civility, combined with ruthless control, that made the crime so unsettling. No wild threats, no unnecessary violence, just a precise, almost robotic robbery. At 2:30 a.m., the final cage was loaded. The robbers did one last check, ensuring nothing was left behind that could trace back to them. Then, just as smoothly as they had arrived, they vanished. They left the employees bound, but unharmed. Dixon was reunited with his family. No one had been killed. No alarms had gone off. The gang was gone into the night, taking with them not just a fortune, but also the confidence of a nation. When police finally arrived, they were stunned. The scale of the theft was unlike anything they'd encountered. Over £53 million, gone without a trace. But for the gang, this wasn't the end. It was just another move in a much bigger game. Because while the vault was now empty, the real challenge was only beginning. How to escape, hide, and keep the money, and how to stay one step ahead of the entire British police force. By dawn on February 22, 2006, the Securitas depot in Tonbridge was surrounded by flashing lights, crime scene tape, and stunned investigators. The scale of the robbery was unprecedented. Over £53 million stolen with military precision, no fatalities, and barely a trace left behind. Detective Superintendent Paul Gladstone stood in the depot's loading bay, arms crossed, scanning the chaos. Employees, still shaken, were giving statements. Forensics combed every inch for clues. The gang had been smart: gloves, masks, no fingerprints, and minimal use of mobile phones. But no crime of this scale could remain invisible for long. The manhunt began immediately. The robbery dominated headlines nationwide. The public was outraged, intrigued, even morbidly impressed. The Great British Heist, some papers called it. Comparisons were drawn to the infamous Great Train Robbery of 1963. But this one was cleaner, colder. Bigger surveillance footage became the first major breakthrough. Although the gang had tried to obscure the cameras, a few angles caught glimpses of vehicles, movement patterns, even fragments of voices. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin building a timeline. Police released vehicle descriptions. Checkpoints were set up across Kent. Interpol was alerted in case of border escapes. Airports, ferries, and train stations were on high alert. But the real lead came from a mistake: trust. A member of the gang had confided in an associate. Someone on the fringes promised a cut, but left out of the real plan. Angry and jealous, the man tipped off police in exchange for immunity. He provided names, meeting locations, and even helped identify one of the fake police vehicles. Raids began within days. In a South London industrial park, police discovered a warehouse containing several crates of cash. Nearly £10 million recovered, but most of it untouched. DNA evidence tied one suspect to the site. In another raid, officers found wigs, masks, uniforms, and a van with fake police markings abandoned behind a scrapyard. Forensics matched the paint and materials to the depot footage. The net was tightening one by one. Arrests followed Leon. The suspected ringleader was picked up in Bromley, trying to flee with a suitcase of cash. Two more were found hiding in Spain, extradited back to the UK. Another was arrested at a hotel in London, drinking champagne in a suite paid for in cash. In total, over 30 individuals were eventually arrested in connection with the robbery, from core planners to minor accomplices. Some cooperated, others refused to speak. But through months of interrogation, surveillance, and financial tracking, police pieced together the operation, and yet, for all the breakthroughs, one fact loomed large. More than £30 million remained missing. Despite multiple discoveries of hidden cash and leads overseas, the bulk of the money was never recovered. Authorities believed much of it had been laundered, smuggled abroad, or buried. Literally, the public fascination grew. Tabloids ran exposés on the robbers' lifestyles: fast cars, rented mansions, girlfriends draped in designer clothes. TV specials aired dramatic reenactments. One suspect even attempted to sell his story to the press. But behind the headlines, police continued the grind. Files were stacked high, new leads emerged and disappeared, trials loomed, sentences were handed down, some harsh, some surprisingly light. And still, the question remained: where was the rest of the money? It was a question that would haunt investigators and thrill conspiracy theorists for years to come. Because while the robbers had been caught, at least in part, the full story was still out there, scattered across borders, buried in vaults, or perhaps still hidden in plain sight. It was supposed to be over. With most of the gang behind bars and trials underway, the authorities had declared the case a partial victory. But in the early hours of a rainy September morning, the illusion shattered at Belmarsh Prison, one of Britain's most secure detention facilities. Chaos erupted. Alarms blared, lockdown protocols failed, and by the time guards regained control, one of the most wanted men in Britain was gone. Lee Murray, a former MMA fighter turned mastermind in the Securitas heist, had vanished from his high-security cell. It wasn't just an escape, it was a statement. Early investigations revealed signs of meticulous planning. CCTV footage had been tampered with, cell locks appeared undamaged. Guards had been reassigned at the last minute due to a system error. One guard later failed a lie detector test, and another mysteriously quit. 2 days before the incident, inside help, it seemed, was almost certain. The news stunned the nation. A man connected to the largest cash robbery in UK history had slipped out of a maximum security prison without leaving a trace. It wasn't just embarrassing. It raised serious questions about corruption and the power of the network behind the heist. Police launched a full internal investigation, but the real focus shifted beyond the walls of Belmarsh. Interpol issued a red notice, the highest level alert for a fugitive considered dangerous and internationally mobile. Border agencies across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East were alerted. Airports, ports, and train stations received his photograph. But Lee was already gone. Rumors swirled. Some said he fled to Spain under a false passport. Others claimed he boarded a private jet out of Luton Airport days before the jailbreak, with bribes clearing his path. There were whispers of connections to drug cartels in Morocco, old associates in Dubai, and a safe house somewhere in the Atlas Mountains. Interpol tracked sightings from Madrid to Casablanca, but none confirmed. What they did find was a paper trail of forged documents, burner phones, and encrypted messages sent through proxy servers. Someone was helping him. Possibly several people, back in the UK. Public pressure mounted. Politicians demanded accountability. Journalists unearthed prison failings, bribery allegations, and security breaches swept under the rug. The question wasn't just how Lee had escaped, but how many others had helped him do it, and at what cost. Meanwhile, the stolen cash was still largely missing. Investigators began to believe the escape might be tied to it. Had the money been used to fund the jailbreak? Or worse, was it being used to protect Lee now, buying loyalty, silence, and sanctuary? Months passed. Then, a breakthrough. A phone call intercepted in Paris, traced to a known associate of the Securitas gang. The conversation hinted at Lee's presence in North Africa. French and British agents coordinated a sting, but by the time they reached the suspected location, it was empty. A burner phone left behind, still warm, Lee Murray had slipped away again. In the criminal underworld, his story became legend. A man who stole millions, faced the full weight of the law, and then walked out of prison like a ghost. The media followed every lead. Films were pitched, books written, yet the man himself remained invisible. To this day, Interpol continues the hunt, but behind every false lead and dead end, one truth remains. The Securitas heist wasn't just a robbery. It was a glimpse into the reach and ruthlessness of organized crime, and the terrifying possibility that with enough planning, money, and connections, even the walls of Britain's toughest prison can be breached. Years had passed since the cold February night, when a gang of criminals walked into the Securitas depot in Tonbridge and stole £53 million. The headlines had faded, the trials concluded, but the shadow of the heist never truly disappeared. Some of the gang were convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. Their faces became familiar to the public, grinning mugshots, courtroom sketches, footage of handcuffed men being led into armored vans. Yet others slipped away, vanishing into the folds of distant cities, their names whispered but never confirmed. Interpol maintained open files on several suspects believed to have escaped the UK before arrests began. Morocco, Spain, Brazil, the list of potential hideouts spanned continents. Rumors persisted that at least one of the gang members had undergone facial surgery and lived comfortably in North Africa, guarded and funded by his share of the missing millions. For British law enforcement, the heist was both a source of shame and a catalyst for change. An internal review of cash-handling security revealed troubling weaknesses, outdated surveillance systems, over-reliance on human access codes, and poor coordination between police and private security firms. In the years that followed, Securitas and similar companies overhauled their depot procedures. Biometric access controls, armed escorts, and real-time GPS tracking for cash-in-transit vehicles became the new standard. The Metropolitan Police also launched a reform of its own. Joint task forces were created between regional forces, MI5, and international crime agencies. It was no longer enough to investigate crime. The Securitas case proved that organized gangs could mimic authority, exploit trust, and dismantle multi-million-pound systems with shocking ease. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with the heist only grew. Documentaries aired on BBC and Netflix. Titles like The Inside Job and Heist: The Securitas Robbery drew millions of viewers, each dissecting the planning, execution, and fallout. Crime podcasts devoted entire seasons to the story, interviewing former detectives, journalists, even family members of the convicted. One series claimed to have tracked some of the missing money to property deals in Dubai. Though no official evidence ever confirmed it, Hollywood, of course, came calling. A feature film inspired by the heist entered development, with a fictional twist. What if one of the gang betrayed the others and vanished with it all? Actors trained in MMA to mimic the real-life fugitive fighter-turned-robber. Though dramatized, the film reignited interest in the real story, and the unanswered question, where is the rest of the money? Of the £53 million stolen, less than half was ever recovered. Police found bundles in garages, warehouses, and buried in fields, but a vast portion simply disappeared. Theories abounded: that it was laundered through casinos in Monaco, invested into businesses in Eastern Europe, or stashed in offshore accounts waiting for the statute of limitations to expire. And then there was the legend of the final escapee, Lee Murray. The ex-cage fighter believed to have helped mastermind the job had become a ghost. Whether hiding in Morocco or dead under a false name, no one could say for sure. Some claimed to have seen him in markets, gyms, even luxury resorts. But every lead ended the same way. With silence, the Securitas heist had long since moved from news to folklore, a modern British myth born of deception, greed, and precision. It left behind broken lives, hardened criminals, and a permanent scar on the institutions that were supposed to prevent such a thing. But more than anything, it left behind a story. A story of how a gang, dressed as the very people sworn to stop them, pulled off one of the most perfect robberies in history, and in many ways, got away with it.